She was 19 and homeless. No family left who would claim her. No money beyond what she could carry in a coffee tin. Just a wool blanket that had belonged to her grandmother and 3 copper coins that together amounted to exactly $3. And with that $3, she bought an abandoned homestead at the far end of the Corbin Valley. A place so forgotten that even the county assessor had crossed it off his ledger with a single line of ink. But what nobody knew, not the clerk who sold it, not the ranchers who rode past it without looking, not even the woman who would pry up the rotted planks with her own hands, was that beneath those floorboards lay something that would change her life and the life of every person in that valley forever. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, take a moment now, because this story is one you will want to hear from beginning to end. Her name was Elara Kane, and she was born on the 7th of March in a narrow clapboard house on the outskirts of Harlan, a mill town pressed into the crease between 2 ridges where the Elk River ran shallow over limestone. Her father was Thomas Kane, a timber cruiser who walked the high forests marking trees for the Harlan Lumber Company. And her mother was Josephine Kane, née Pruitt, who had come to Harlan at 17 to work in the company store, and who married Thomas 6 months later in a ceremony attended by 11 people and a dog that belonged to no one in particular. Elara was their second child. Her brother David was 4 years older and quiet in the way that oldest children in poor families often are, carrying responsibilities he never asked for with a patience that looked, from the outside, like indifference. The family was not destitute, but they were close enough to it that the difference was academic. Thomas earned 40 cents a day plus board when he was in the field, and Josephine took in mending and kept a kitchen garden that fed them through the summers and, when the canning went well, into the early months of winter. They owned the house but not the land beneath it, which was leased from the lumber company at a rate that rose a little every year, the way water rises in a cellar, slowly enough that you do not notice until your boots are wet. Elara's childhood was shaped by 2 things: work and her grandmother, Bet Pruitt, who lived alone in a cabin 4 miles up the ridge road, and who was, by any honest accounting, the most capable person Elara ever knew. Bet had been widowed at 31 when her husband, a man named Orrin Pruitt, was killed by a falling spruce during a windstorm in the winter of 1847. She had raised Josephine and Josephine's 2 brothers alone on that ridge, growing potatoes and turnips in soil so rocky. She once told Elara that she could have planted a stone and harvested a boulder. Bet was small and lean, and her hands were the hands of someone who had never stopped working. The knuckles swollen, the fingers curved slightly inward even at rest, the skin across her palms as thick and smooth as saddle leather. She wore her white hair in a single braid that hung to the middle of her back, and she had a way of looking at you when you spoke that made you feel that every word you said was being weighed and measured and stored somewhere permanent. It was Bet who taught Elara to use tools, not in the way that children are sometimes taught, handed a hammer and told to tap gently at a nail already started, but properly, with seriousness and expectation. By the time Elara was 10, she could sharpen a draw knife on an oilstone, true the edge of a plane blade, and split a shingle from a cedar bolt with a froe and mallet. By 12, she could hang a door so that it swung true and latched clean, and she could read the grain of a board well enough to know which face to put up and which to put down, and where the wood would want to cup if you let it dry unevenly. Bette taught her these things not with lectures, but with demonstration and correction, standing beside her at the workbench in the little shed behind the cabin, guiding Elara's hands with her own when the angle was wrong, saying only, "Feel that? That is the wood telling you where it wants to go." Bet believed that every material had a nature, and that the job of the person working it was to understand that nature and cooperate with it rather than fight it, and she extended this philosophy to people as well, though she was less patient with people than she was with wood. When Alara was 14, her father was injured in the forest. A dead limb, what the timbermen called a widowmaker, fell from a hemlock and struck him across the shoulders, and though it did not kill him, it broke something in his back that never healed correctly. He came home on a stretcher made from 2 poles and a canvas sheet, and he never walked into the forest again. The lumber company gave him nothing. No payment, no pension, no acknowledgement beyond a notation in the foreman's ledger that read, T. Kane, retired from service. Thomas spent the next 2 years in a chair by the window, growing thinner and quieter, and Josephine worked longer hours at the mending and took on laundry as well. And David, who was 18 by then, went to work at the mill itself, feeding logs into the saw carriage for 35 cents a day. Alara divided her time between the house, where she cooked and cleaned and tended her father, and Bet's cabin, where she continued to learn. It was during this period that Bet gave her the object she would carry for the rest of her life. A small folding knife with a bone handle and a blade that had been reground so many times, it was narrow as a willow leaf. It had belonged to Orrin Pruitt. Bet placed it in Alara's palm one afternoon without ceremony and said, "He would have liked you. You pay attention the way he did." Alara closed her fingers around it and felt the warmth of the bone and the weight of the brass bolsters, and she understood that she was being given something that could not be replaced. Thomas Kane died in the autumn of that year, on a Tuesday, with the windows open and the smell of wood smoke coming in from somewhere down the road. He was 43 years old. Josephine sold the house, or rather, surrendered it back to the lumber company in exchange for the cancellation of 2 years of back rent, and moved with David into a boarding house in town. Alara went to live with Bet for 2 years, from the time she was 15 until she was 17. Alara lived in the ridge cabin, and those were, she would later say, the best years of her life. She and Bet worked side by side every day, mending the cabin, tending the garden, cutting firewood, putting up food for winter. Bet taught her to lay a stone foundation, to mix lime mortar, to read weather in the movement of birds and the color of the sky at evening. They did not talk a great deal, but the silence between them was the silence of 2 people who understood each other completely. And when they did speak, it was usually about the work at hand, and the words were precise and practical and sufficient. Bet died 2 weeks after Alara's 17th birthday. She died in her sleep, in the bed she had shared with Orrin Pruitt 50 years earlier. And when Alara found her in the morning, she was lying on her side with one hand tucked beneath her cheek and the other resting on the quilt. And she looked, Alara thought, like someone who had simply decided she was finished. Alara washed her and dressed her in her good wool dress and wrapped her in the quilt and buried her beside Orrin in the little plot behind the cabin, digging the grave herself in ground that was half frozen and full of roots, working for 6 hours with a pick and a shovel until the hole was deep enough and straight enough to satisfy her. She did not cry. She stood beside the grave and said, "Thank you for everything you taught me." And then she went inside and sat at the workbench and held the bone-handled knife in both hands and was still for a long time. She stayed in the cabin for nearly 2 years after that, living alone, keeping the garden, doing odd work for neighbors when there were neighbors who needed it. She was not unhappy, but she was alone in a way that went deeper than solitude, because the person who had known her best was gone, and the people who remained, her mother, her brother, had become strangers to her in the slow way that people become strangers when they stop sharing daily life. She visited Josephine and David at the boarding house once a month, walking the 4 miles down the ridge and the 2 miles into town, and each visit was a little shorter and a little more strained than the one before. Josephine had taken up with a man named Gerald Foss, a clerk at the feed store, who wore a pressed collar and who looked at Ilara as though she were something tracked in on a boot sole. David had married a girl named Catherine, and they had a room of their own at the boarding house and a baby on the way, and David's eyes, when he looked at Ilara, held the particular discomfort of someone who loves you but cannot afford to show it. It was Gerald Foss who ended it, not with violence, not with shouting, but with the quiet, administrative cruelty of a man who understood that power is most effective when it is exercised calmly. Ilara came down from the ridge on a Saturday in late October, the month she turned 19, and found the door of the boarding house locked. A note had been pinned to the frame with a tack. It was written in Gerald's careful clerk's hand, and it said, "Ilara, your mother and I have discussed the matter, and we feel it is best for everyone if you make your own arrangements going forward. Your belongings are in the box by the step. We wish you well." There was a wooden crate beside the door containing a change of clothes, a pair of wool stockings, her grandmother's blanket, and the coffee tin in which she kept her savings, $3 in copper coins. That was all. No signature from her mother. No word from David. Just the note and the box and the locked door and the sound of someone moving behind the curtained window who did not come out. Ilara read the note once. She folded it and placed it in the pocket of her coat. She knelt beside the crate and transferred its contents into the blanket, which she rolled and tied with a length of cord, and she slung the bundle over her shoulder and picked up the coffee tin and stood for a moment looking at the door. She did not knock. She did not call out. She did not cry. She turned and walked down the steps and into the road, and she did not look back. And if anyone in the boarding house watched her go, they did so from behind the curtain, which is the way that cowardice always watches courage, from a safe distance, through a veil. She walked west, because west was the direction she happened to be facing when she reached the end of the road and had to choose. The afternoon was cold and dry, and the sky was the color of pewter, and the wind came down from the ridges carrying the smell of pine resin and frozen earth. She followed the main road for 3 miles until it forked, and she took the left fork because it was narrower and quieter and led away from town rather than toward the next one, and she walked along it as the light changed from gray to gold to the deep amber of late afternoon. The road descended through a stand of ponderosa pine, the trunks tall and straight and orange-barked in the low light. And then it crossed a creek on a bridge made of 3 hewn logs laid side by side, and the water beneath was clear and fast, and she could see the stones on the bottom, each one distinct. And she stopped on the bridge and drank from her cupped hands, and the water was so cold it made her teeth ache. Beyond the creek, the road climbed again, switchbacking up a long slope covered in bunch grass and sage. And at the top of the slope, the land opened out into a valley she had never seen before. It was wide and long and bounded on 3 sides by mountains, whose upper slopes were dark with timber and whose peaks held the last of the season's snow. A river ran through the center of the valley, not large but steady, catching the late light in a way that made it look like a ribbon of hammered tin laid across the brown and gold of the grass. There were ranches scattered along the valley floor. She could see the dark shapes of barns and the thin lines of fences and the occasional smudge of chimney smoke. But they were widely spaced, separated by miles of open land, and the overall impression was one of enormous quiet. She stood at the top of the slope and looked out at it and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but the space where hope could be if she let it. She descended into the valley as the sun set behind the western ridge, and the shadows of the mountains stretched across the grass like dark water filling a basin. And by the time she reached the valley floor, the air had turned cold enough that she could see her breath. She walked along the river road for another mile and came to a small settlement. 4 buildings clustered at a crossroads, none of them large. There was a general store with a porch and a hitching rail, a blacksmith shop with its forge cold and dark, a building that might have been a church or a schoolhouse, and a low stone structure with a sign that read, Corbin Valley Land Office, J.R. Hadley, Assessor. The store was closed, but there was lamplight in the window of the land office, and Alara walked toward it because light, in that moment, meant the possibility of warmth and information, and perhaps a direction to go next. She pushed open the door and stepped into a room that was small and close and heated by a cast-iron stove in the corner. Behind a desk made of rough-sawn pine sat a man of perhaps 60, with white hair cut short and spectacles that sat low on his nose, and a ledger book open before him that was so large it covered most of the desk. He looked up when she entered and studied her for a moment. The bundle on her shoulder, the coffee tin in her hand, the mud on her boots, the steadiness of her gaze. And he said, "You look like you have walked a long way." "I have," she said. His name was James Hadley, and he had been the county assessor for the Corbin Valley for 22 years, and he knew every parcel of land in the valley the way a shepherd knows every sheep in his flock, by name and location and history and temperament. He offered her a chair and a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, and he listened while she explained, in as few words as possible, that she was looking for land. She did not tell him why she was alone or where she had come from or what had happened at the boarding house door. She simply said she had $3 and she wanted to know if $3 could buy anything in the Corbin Valley. Hadley removed his spectacles and cleaned them on his sleeve and replaced them and looked at her again with an expression that was not pity but something closer to recognition, as though he had seen someone like her before and remembered how that story had gone. He turned the pages of his ledger slowly, running his finger down columns of figures. And after a long moment, he stopped and tapped a line of ink and said, "There is one property, the Holm place, 40 acres at the head of the East Fork, with a cabin and a root cellar and a well. It has been abandoned for 11 years. The county has been carrying the taxes, and nobody has ever come to claim it. The total owed is $2.80. He looked at her over his spectacles. $3 would cover it with 20 cents to spare. Alara set the coffee tin on the desk and opened it and counted out the coins. 30 copper pieces, each one worn smooth. And she pushed them across the pine surface toward James Hadley, and he counted them again and wrote a receipt in his ledger and tore it out and handed it to her. And just like that, for the price of $3, Alara Kane became the owner of 40 acres of land she had never seen, a cabin she had never entered, and whatever lay within it and beneath it and around it, known and unknown, visible and hidden. She reached the Holm place the following morning, having slept that night in the land office on a blanket Hadley spread beside the stove. He had drawn her a map on the back of a tax notice. Follow the river road east for 4 miles. Take the right fork where the cottonwoods grow in a line. Follow the creek upstream for another 2 miles until you see the cabin on the north bank. And the map was precise, and she found the place without difficulty, arriving just as the morning sun cleared the eastern ridge and poured down into the narrow valley of the East Fork like something liquid and golden being tipped from a bowl. The cabin stood in a clearing on a slight rise above the creek, and the first thing Alara noticed was the roof. It was cedar shake, or had been, but time and weather had worked on it until the shakes were curled and split and gray as old bone, and in several places they had fallen away entirely, leaving gaps through which she could see the dark interior. The cabin itself was built of hewn logs, each one roughly 10 inches square, notched at the corners in a saddle joint that had been cut with care. She could see that even from a distance. The chinking between the logs was mostly gone, fallen out in long crumbling strips, and the gaps let in light and wind and rain. But the logs themselves were sound. They were lodgepole pine, straight-grained and dense, and whatever the years had done to the roof and the chinking, the bones of the structure were good. The cabin was perhaps 16 feet by 20, a single room with a door on the south side and 2 windows, one east and one west, both of which had lost their glass. A stone chimney rose from the north wall, built of river rock laid in courses, and it was intact except for the very top, where 2 or 3 stones had fallen and lay in the grass below like teeth knocked from a jaw. She walked around the cabin slowly, looking at everything. The door hung on leather hinges that had dried and cracked, but still held, and when she pushed it open, it swung inward with a sound like a long exhalation. Inside, the cabin was dim and cold, and smelled of earth and old wood and something faintly sweet that might have been dried wildflowers, or might have been the particular scent of a place that has been closed up and left to its own slow processes for more than a decade. The floor was made of wide pine planks, hand-planed, laid across joists that rested on a foundation of stacked stone. Some of the planks had warped and lifted, and in one corner near the fireplace a section of floor had buckled upward as though something beneath it were pressing from below. There was a table against the west wall, still standing, made of the same pine as the floor, and a single chair beside it that had lost one leg and leaned against the wall at an angle. A shelf above the fireplace held 3 tin cups, a candle stub, and a small glass bottle with something dried inside it. Wildflowers, she thought, or herbs. The fireplace itself was deep and wide, the firebox blackened with years of use, and the hearthstone was a single slab of gray granite, smooth and flat, that extended 2 feet into the room. She set her bundle on the table and stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking at everything with the eyes Bet had trained her to use. Eyes that saw not what a thing was, but what it could become. The roof needed replacing entirely. The chinking needed to be redone from foundation to eaves. The windows needed glass or oiled paper, or at least shutters that could be closed against the weather. The floor needed to be pulled up and relaid where it had warped. The chimney needed its missing stones replaced. The door needed new hinges. But the walls were sound, and the foundation was solid, and the fireplace drew well. She could tell by the pattern of soot on the stones. And the location was good, sheltered from the north wind by the rise of the hill, with water close and timber closer, and a southern exposure that would catch the winter sun. It was, she thought, a good place. It was a place that had been loved once and then left, and it was waiting, with the patience that only empty buildings have, for someone to love it again. She began with the floor. It was the practical choice. You cannot repair a roof if the surface you stand on shifts beneath your feet. And it was also the choice her grandmother would have made, because Bet Pruitt believed that everything in a house starts with what is underfoot, that the foundation and the floor are the truth of a structure, and everything above them is just conversation. Ilara knelt beside the buckled section near the fireplace and ran her fingers along the seam where 2 planks had lifted and separated, and she could feel the draft coming up from below, cold and damp and carrying the mineral smell of earth that has not seen sunlight in years. She took the bone-handled knife from her pocket and opened it and slid the blade into the seam and worked it back and forth, gently, the way Bet had taught her to work a joint apart without splitting the wood. And the first plank came up with a groan and a release of dust that hung in the morning light like something alive. Beneath the plank was darkness, and beneath the darkness was the packed earth of the crawl space, and she could see the stone piers on which the joists rested, each one stacked carefully, flat river rocks chosen for their uniformity and laid without mortar, but with a precision that spoke of someone who understood weight and balance. She pulled up the second plank, and then the third, working her way along the buckled section, and it was when she lifted the fourth plank, the one closest to the hearthstone, that she saw it. Not immediately. At first it was just a shape in the shadows, something that did not belong to the geometry of stone and earth and wood. She leaned closer, and her eyes adjusted, and she saw that someone had dug a shallow cavity in the earth between two of the stone piers. A rectangular hole, perhaps 18 inches long and 12 inches wide and 8 inches deep. And into this cavity they had placed a tin box. The box was the kind that had once held tea or biscuits, rectangular with a fitted lid, and it was dark with tarnish but intact. She reached down and lifted it out, and it was heavier than she expected, and when she set it on the floor beside her and brushed the dirt from its surface, she could see that the lid had been sealed with a strip of waxed cloth pressed into the seam, and whoever had done this had done it with the intention that the contents would survive. She peeled the waxed cloth away carefully, working the edge with her knife, and she lifted the lid and looked inside. There were 3 things in the box. The first was money, coins, mostly silver, some gold, stacked in neat columns and wrapped in scraps of cloth to keep them from shifting. She did not count them then, but she would later, and the total would come to $147, a sum so large that when she finally understood it, she would sit very still for a long time with her hands in her lap. The second thing was a small object wrapped in a piece of soft leather. She set it aside for the moment. The third thing, resting on top of the coins, was a letter. It was written on a single sheet of paper that had been folded twice and sealed with a drop of candle wax. And the paper was yellowed but dry, and the ink was brown but legible. And Alara unfolded it and held it in the light from the open door and read it. The letter said this: "My name is Annika Holm. I am 53 years old, and I have lived in this cabin for 21 years, since my husband Eric and I built it together in the spring of 1841. Eric died in the winter of 1849 from a fever that took him in 3 days, and I have lived here alone since then. I am writing this letter because I am leaving. My body is tired, and my eyes are failing, and I cannot keep the place any longer. And I am going to my sister in Salem, and I do not expect I will return. I am leaving this money because I earned it honestly, by my own labor, selling butter and eggs and garden seed to the people of this valley for 21 years, and because I have no children to leave it to, and no one who needs it more than whoever comes next. If you are reading this, then you have come to this place, and you have lifted these boards, and you have found what I left for you. I do not know who you are. I do not know if you are young or old, man or woman, rich or poor. But I know this: you are here, and this place needs someone, and maybe you need it too. Take the money and use it well. Fix the roof. It was already leaking when I left. Replace the chinking on the north wall first, because that is where the wind comes hardest. The well is good. The soil along the creek is the best soil in the valley for growing things. I have left you one other thing, which belonged to Eric. He carved it during our first winter here, when the snow was deep and the nights were long, and he wanted to make something beautiful for no reason other than that beauty is worth making. I hope you will keep it. I hope you will be happy here. I hope this place will be as good to you as it was to me. Annika Holm, October 1862. Ilara read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the floor beside her and unwrapped the soft leather bundle. And inside was a small carved wooden bird, a meadowlark, no larger than her thumb, rendered with extraordinary delicacy. The feathers suggested by fine lines cut with a knife point, the beak slightly open as though it were about to sing, the eyes 2 tiny dots of darker wood inlaid into the pale body. It had been carved from a piece of birch, and the wood had aged to the color of honey, and it was warm in her hand the way that wood is always warm, warmer than metal, warmer than stone, holding whatever heat you give it and returning it slowly. She held it for a long time. Then she placed it on the shelf above the fireplace, beside the 3 tin cups and the glass bottle, and she placed Annika Holm's letter beside it. And she sat on the floor of the cabin with the tin box of coins in her lap, and the morning light coming through the open door, and she was quiet and still, and she did not cry, but something in her face changed, softened, opened, the way a door opens when someone on the other side has finally found the key. She began the repairs that same afternoon. The money meant she could buy materials she could not make or find. Glass for the windows, nails, a new axe head to replace the one she found in the shed behind the cabin rusted beyond saving. But the labor would be her own, and she wanted it that way, because work was the language she spoke most fluently, and because every board she planned and every stone she set would be a conversation between herself and this place, between herself and Annika Holm, between herself and Bet Pruitt, between her own 2 hands and the future she was building with them. She started with the roof, despite Annika's advice about the north wall, because a house without a roof is not a house but a suggestion, and the autumn rains would come soon. She felled cedar in the stand behind the cabin, selecting trees of the right diameter, and she bucked them into bolts 20 inches long and split shakes from each bolt with the froe she found hanging on a peg in the shed, its handle worn smooth by Annika's hands or Eric's hands or both. The froe was a good one, the blade still true, and Ilara sharpened it on a flat stone from the creek and began splitting. Each shake came off the bolt with a clean, fibrous tear, and she stacked them in rows to dry for 3 days before carrying them up the ladder she built from 2 lodgepole pines and cross pieces lashed with rawhide. She stripped the old shakes and replaced the damaged lath beneath them, and laid the new shakes in overlapping courses, starting from the eaves and working upward, each course offset from the one below so that the water would run from shake to shake and never find a seam to enter. It took her 11 days to finish the roof, working from first light until the light failed, and when it was done, she stood in the clearing and looked up at it, and it was tight and even and good. The chinking came next, and it was during this work that the first of the valley people found her. His name was Orrin Calloway. The coincidence of the first name was not lost on her, and he was 61 years old, and he ranched 320 acres 4 miles down the creek, running cattle and a small band of sheep. And he had ridden up the East Fork to check on a section of fence, and had seen the smoke from her chimney, and come to investigate because no smoke had risen from the Holm place in over a decade. He sat on his horse and watched her for a full minute as she mixed lime and sand and clay in a wooden trough. And then he dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post and walked over and looked at her mortar and said, "You need more eat." "I know," she said. "I am stretching what I have." He rode away without another word, and returned 2 hours later with a 50-pound sack of lime across his saddle, and set it on the ground beside her trough, and said, "That should help," and rode away again. He did not ask her name. He did not ask how she had come to be there. He looked at her work and saw that it was competent, and that was enough. 3 days later, a woman named Ida Bergstrom appeared. She was 44, the wife of a wheat farmer named Carl Bergstrom, whose land lay at the wide part of the valley, and she came on foot carrying a basket covered with a cloth. Inside the basket were a loaf of bread, a jar of blackberry preserves, a wedge of hard cheese, and 6 eggs wrapped individually in scraps of wool. She set the basket on the porch and said, "I am Ida. Oren told us someone was fixing the home place. I brought you some things." Ilara thanked her, and Ida looked at the new roof and the fresh chinking on the north wall and said, "Annika would be glad." And then she walked back down the creek road, and Ilara stood on the porch holding the basket and understood that she had been seen. That word was traveling through the valley in the quiet way that word travels in places where people are spread far apart, but connected by the invisible threads of shared landscape and shared weather and shared knowledge of what it means to live at the edge of things. They came one by one over the following weeks, each bringing something specific, each staying only long enough to deliver what they had brought and to observe her work and to say a few words that were practical rather than sentimental. A man named Dawson Greaves, 37, who operated the blacksmith shop at the crossroads, rode up with a box of hand-forged nails and a new set of leather hinges for the door, and he helped her hang the door and showed her a trick for setting a hinge pin so that it would not work loose, and he told her that he had shod Eric Holmes' horses 30 years ago when he was a boy apprenticed to his father. A woman named Ruth Okafor, 29, who taught at the schoolhouse and kept bees on a 1/4 acre behind it, brought 2 panes of glass wrapped in burlap and a pot of honey and a copy of a seed catalog that was 2 years out of date but still useful. A boy named Samuel Lund, 14, whose family ranched on the west side of the valley, appeared one morning with a handcart containing a cast-iron cookpot, a skillet, and a set of tin plates, and he said his mother had sent them, and that his mother said to tell her the well water was sweet if she let it sit overnight before drinking. Ilara accepted everything with the same quiet gravity with which it was offered. She did not make speeches of gratitude. She said thank you, and she meant it, and the people who brought things understood that she meant it because they could see it in the way she handled what they gave her. Carefully, with respect, the way you handle something that matters. And she worked. She worked every day from the hour the light was strong enough to see by until the hour it was not. And the cabin changed around her the way a living thing changes when it is cared for, slowly and then all at once. The gaps closing, the surfaces smoothing, the structure tightening until it was no longer an abandoned shell but a shelter. Not yet a home, but something very close to it. Something that was waiting for the last thing that would make it one. She relaid the floor, planing each warped plank on a bench she built in the yard, working the wood with the draw knife and the hand plane until the surfaces were flat and true, and she fitted the planks back into place and pegged them to the joists with oak dowels she whittled in the evenings by the fire. She repointed the chimney, climbing a ladder with a bucket of mortar and setting each fallen stone back into its course, matching the original pattern so precisely that when she was finished, you could not tell which stones had been reset and which had never moved. She built a bed frame from lodgepole pine, lashing the joints with rawhide in the way Bet had taught her, and she stuffed a mattress tick with dried grass and wild mint and laid her grandmother's blanket over it. And the first night she slept in the bed, she slept without waking until dawn, which she had not done since Bet died. The garden she started in the strip of dark soil along the creek, turning the earth with a spade Dawson Greaves forged for her in exchange for a day's labor splitting fence rails. And she planted the seeds Ruth Okafor helped her order from the catalog. Turnips, potatoes, carrots, onions, beans, and a row of sunflowers along the south edge, because Annika's letter had mentioned beauty, and Alara thought sunflowers were the most honest kind of beauty there was, tall and obvious and unashamed. Orrin Calloway brought her 2 laying hens in a crate and refused payment and said only, "They are good layers. The brown one is mean." Ida Bergstrom taught her which wild plants along the creek were edible and which were medicinal and which were neither. And they spent an afternoon together gathering watercress and wild onion and yarrow. And Ida told her stories about the valley, who had homesteaded where, who had stayed and who had left, how the river had flooded in the spring of 1856 and taken out every bridge for 15 miles. Ilara listened to all of it and stored it the way Bet had stored things, carefully, in a place where it would not be lost. By the first snowfall, the cabin was whole. The roof was tight, the walls were chinked, the windows held glass. The door swung true on its new hinges. The chimney drew clean. The floor was smooth and level and solid underfoot. The garden was put to bed for winter. The root cellar stocked with potatoes and turnips and carrots and onions and jars of preserved berries that Ida had taught her to put up. The 2 hens, she named them Josephine and Bet, which was a private joke she shared with no one, roosted in a small coop she built against the south wall of the cabin, and the brown one was indeed mean, and Ilara respected her for it. There was wood stacked under the eaves, enough to last until March if she was careful, and there was water in the well, and there was food in the cellar, and there was a fire in the hearth, and there was a roof that did not leak. And these things, taken together, constituted something that Ilara had not had since Bet's cabin on the ridge, something she had not dared to name until now. She sat in the chair she had repaired, the broken leg replaced with a new one she turned on a makeshift lathe, matching the taper and the grain as closely as she could, and she looked at the shelf above the fireplace. The 3 tin cups were still there, and the glass bottle with its dried flowers, and beside them now were 2 new things. Annika Holmes' letter, folded and leaning against the wall, and Eric Holmes' carved meadowlark, standing on its small flat base with its beak open to the room. And beside the meadowlark, placed there on the day she moved in and not moved since, was Orrin Pruitt's bone-handled knife, closed, resting on its side. 2 objects made by 2 people who had loved someone they never got to see grow old, left behind like messages in a language that only the right person could read. She thought about Annika Holm, who had lived in this cabin for 21 years and who had earned $147, 1 egg and 1 pound of butter at a time, and who had buried it beneath her floor, not because she was afraid, but because she believed that someone would come after her and that someone would need it. She thought about Eric Holm, who had carved a meadowlark during a long winter because beauty is worth making. She thought about Bet Pruitt, who had placed a knife in a girl's hand and said, "He would have liked you." She thought about Orrin Pruitt, who had died under a falling tree and whose knife had outlived him by decades and was still sharp and still warm in the hand. She thought about the people of the Corbin Valley, who had come to her one by one with nails and lime and bread and glass and hens and seeds and stories, not because she had asked, but because that is what people do when they recognize someone who is trying to make something out of nothing, someone who is doing the work. She did not think about Gerald Foss. She did not think about the note on the door. She did not think about the locked boarding house or the curtain that did not move. These things had happened, and they were true, and she carried them the way she carried everything, quietly, without complaint, in a place where they could not be lost, but also could not do further harm. The fire cracked and settled in the hearth. The wind moved across the roof and found no way in. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling on the valley, covering the brown grass and the dark river and the fences and the roads in a silence so complete it was almost a sound of its own. And the cabin was warm, and the light from the fire moved across the walls and the floor and the shelf where the meadowlark stood with its beak open, singing a song that only the room could hear. Ilara Kane was 19 years old. She had been cast out with nothing but a blanket and a knife, and $3 in copper coins. And she had walked into a valley she had never seen, and bought a place that no one wanted for a price that no one believed could buy anything worth having. And beneath the floorboards of that place, a woman she would never meet had left her everything she needed. Not just the money, though the money mattered, but the proof that someone had been here before her and had loved this place, and had believed that whoever came next deserved a chance. It was the best $3 she ever spent. She was 20 years old and had nothing left but a canvas rucksack, a wool blanket that smelled of cedar, and $2 silver pressed flat against the lining of her coat pocket. No family, no address, no plan that extended past the next meal. And with those $2, she bought a forgotten plantation house on the edge of the Shenandoah Valley that had not seen a living soul in 11 years. But what nobody knew, what she herself would not discover for weeks, was that beneath the crumbling hearthstone of the main fireplace, someone had buried something meant to be found, and what was written on the paper wrapped around it would change the entire course of her life. If you're new here, subscribe and follow along, because this story is worth hearing all the way through. Her name was Eliza Kane, and she was born in the winter of 1851 in a narrow clapboard house on the outskirts of Charlottesville, Virginia, the third of 5 children and the only girl. Her father, Thomas Kane, was a farrier by trade, a man who shod horses for the plantations that spread across Albemarle County like green quilts stitched together by stone walls and creek beds. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a precise one, and the farmers trusted him because he never overcharged and never left a shoe loose. Her mother, Catherine, had been a seamstress before her marriage and continued to take in mending after it, and the house always smelled of hot iron and damp wool and the particular sweetness of thread wax. Eliza grew up in a household where work was the grammar of love. You did not say you cared for someone. You mended their coat. You sharpened their blade. You rose before dawn to stoke the fire so the house would be warm when they woke. Her brothers, Samuel, James, Peter, and the youngest, Henry, were loud and physical boys who wrestled in the yard and broke things and were forgiven for it. And Eliza learned early that the rules that applied to her were different, quieter, and more exacting. She was expected to cook, to clean, to sew, to keep the ledger of household expenses in a hand so neat it could have been typeset. She did all of these things well, and she did them without complaint. And the fact that she also wanted to learn her father's trade, wanted to understand the geometry of a hoof, the temper of iron, the way a well-set nail could hold for months through mud and stone, was treated as an eccentricity that would pass. It did not pass. When she was 12, her father began letting her work the bellows in his shop, and by 14 she could draw a shoe to shape on the anvil, and by 16 she could trim and fit a hoof with a confidence that made her brothers, who had no interest in the work, look away in something between admiration and unease. Thomas Kane did not praise her often, but he let her stand beside him, and in their family that was the highest form of recognition. He gave her his farrier's rasp when she turned 17, a tool with a hickory handle worn smooth by 30 years of his grip, and told her it was the most honest tool he owned, because it could only take away what was not needed. She kept it wrapped in oilcloth in her rucksack from that day forward, and she never used it without thinking of his hands. Thomas Kane died in the autumn of 1867, thrown from a horse he was shoeing for a man named Garrett, who had not warned him the animal was greenbroke. He struck his head on the corner of a water trough and did not wake up. Eliza was 16. Her mother, who had always been thin and precise and quietly fierce, became something else after that. Not broken exactly, but rearranged, as though the loss had shifted the furniture of her personality, and she could no longer find her way through familiar rooms. Within a year, Catherine Kane married a man named Horace Pemberton, a dry goods merchant from Richmond, who had come to Charlottesville to open a store, and who saw in Catherine a woman who could keep his books and manage his household, and ask very little in return. Horace was not cruel in any way that left marks. He was simply a man who had purchased a life and expected it to function according to his specifications. He was 43, with a soft belly and hard opinions, and a way of speaking to Eliza's brothers that made them feel small, and a way of not speaking to Eliza at all that made her feel invisible. He did not like that she worked with tools. He did not like that she smelled of iron and hoof oil. He did not like that she read books he had not approved, or that she walked alone to her father's old shop, which still stood empty at the edge of town, and sat inside it with the door closed. He told Catherine that the girl needed direction, and Catherine, who was tired and afraid and no longer sure of her own judgment, agreed. Eliza's brothers left one by one, Samuel to work on the railroad, James to a logging camp in West Virginia, Peter to the merchant marine, and Henry, the youngest and the one Eliza loved most fiercely, to an apprenticeship with a carpenter in Staunton. Each departure was a small amputation. By the time Eliza was 19, it was just her and her mother and Horace in the house that no longer smelled of thread wax and iron, but of Horace's pipe tobacco and the particular staleness of a home where no one laughs. The woman who shaped Eliza most deeply, apart from her father, was not her mother, but a woman named Mabel Thorne, who lived alone in a stone cottage 2 miles outside Charlottesville, and who had been, at various points in her life, a midwife, a tanner, a beekeeper, and a teacher of reading to anyone who wanted to learn. Mabel was 68 when Eliza first knocked on her door at the age of 13, carrying a book she had found in her father's shop and could not make sense of, a manual on veterinary farriery published in Philadelphia. Mabel read the first chapter aloud to her, explained the diagrams, and then said, "Come back Tuesday and bring your own pencil." Eliza came back every Tuesday for 6 years. Mabel taught her to read not just words but structures, how a house was framed, how a stone wall was laid, how a chimney drew, how soil told you what it could grow by its color and texture and smell. She taught her to make soap and candles, and to tan a rabbit hide, and to set a broken bone in a splint of willow bark and cotton strips. She taught her to keep bees and to read weather and to build a fire that would burn all night on 2 logs if you placed them correctly. Mabel had been widowed at 31 and had never remarried, and she told Eliza once while they were smoking a hive together in the late summer heat that the most important thing a woman could possess was not beauty or charm or even kindness, but competence. Because competence could not be taken away by anyone. Not by a husband, not by a father, not by God himself. Mabel died in the spring of 1870, quietly, in her sleep, with her boots still on and a cup of cold tea on the table beside her bed. She left Eliza her beekeeper's veil, her tanning knives, and a small leather-bound notebook filled with recipes, remedies, and observations about the natural world, written in a hand so small you needed good light to read it. Eliza carried that notebook in her rucksack beside her father's rasp, and together they formed the entirety of her inheritance. Not money, not land, not a name that opened doors, but knowledge made physical, tools that fit her hands, and the memory of two people who had seen her clearly and believed she was enough. The morning Eliza was cast out was a Tuesday in October of 1871, and the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and the first rot of fallen apples in the orchard behind the house. She had been at Mabel's old cottage the day before, cleaning it out as she did every few months to keep the mice from nesting in the walls, and she had come home late, past the hour Horace considered acceptable for a woman to be walking alone. She had not argued with him. She had simply walked past him in the hallway and gone to her room, and she heard him speaking to her mother through the wall in a voice too low to make out the words, but too sharp to mistake the tone. In the morning, when she came downstairs, her rucksack was sitting on the front porch, packed with her clothes and her blanket, and her father's rasp and Mabel's notebook, and nothing else. The front door was locked. A note had been pinned to the rucksack with a straight pin, written in Horace's careful merchant's hand on a piece of his store stationery. It read, "Eliza, it has been decided that you will make your own way from this point forward. Your mother agrees this is best. Do not return to this house. Enclosed are $2 silver for your immediate needs. H. Pemberton." The $2 silver were in a small envelope tucked inside the rucksack's front pocket. Eliza stood on the porch for a long time, holding the note, reading it twice, and then folding it into a square and placing it in her coat pocket beside the envelope. She did not knock on the door. She did not call her mother's name. She did not cry, though something behind her ribs felt like a door closing in a room she would never enter again. She looked at the house, the clapboard siding her father had painted white every third spring, the window box where her mother had once grown herbs, the chimney that leaned slightly to the east because the foundation had settled unevenly in the year she was born. And she picked up her rucksack, settled it on her shoulders, and walked down the porch steps and out through the gate and onto the road that led west. She was 20 years old. She had $2, a wool blanket, a farrier's rasp, a beekeeper's notebook, and the clothes she was wearing. She did not look back, not because she was brave, but because she understood, with the clarity that only loss can provide, that looking back would not change what was behind her and would only slow her progress toward whatever lay ahead. She walked west because the road went west, and because the mountains were there, and because she had read in Mabel's notebook, in an entry dated June of 1859, that the Shenandoah Valley was the most forgiving land in Virginia. Deep soil, clean water, mild winters by mountain standards, and a habit of absorbing people who had nowhere else to go. She walked for 3 days. The first night she slept in a hay barn beside the road outside Waynesboro, burrowed into loose hay with her blanket pulled over her head and the rucksack pressed against her chest, like a child holding a doll. The second night, she slept under a rock overhang above a creek whose name she did not know, and the water made a sound all night like someone turning pages in a book. And she lay awake listening to it and watching the stars through the gap in the trees above her and feeling, for the first time since her father died, something that was not grief or anger, but a strange, clean emptiness, as though she had been scraped out like a gourd and was waiting to be filled with something new. The third day she crossed the Blue Ridge through a gap where the road narrowed to a wagon's width and the trees pressed close on both sides, and when she came through to the other side, the valley opened below her like a green hand laid flat on the earth, and the light was different, softer, more golden, filtered through a haze that hung over the fields and the river and the distant line of the Alleghenies beyond. She stood at the top of the gap for a long time, breathing air that smelled of pine sap and river mud and the faint sweetness of late-season clover, and she felt the emptiness inside her shift and settle into something more like readiness. The road descended through switchbacks into a small town called Millbrook, which was not much more than a crossroads with a general store, a blacksmith shop, a church with a cedar-shake roof, and a scattering of houses set back from the road behind split-rail fences. The store was run by a man named Amos Kettle, who was 70 years old and had the particular patience of someone who had seen enough of the world to know that most of what happened in it was not worth getting excited about. Eliza bought a pound of cornmeal and a quarter-pound of salt with 15 cents from one of her silver dollars and asked if there was work in the valley for someone who could shoe horses and mend fences and keep bees. Amos Kettle looked at her for a long moment, at her boots, which were worn but well-oiled, and at her hands, which were calloused in the right places, and at her eyes, which were steady and did not look away. And he said, "There might be. Depends on what you're willing to live in." She told him she was willing to live in anything that had a roof and 4 walls, and he nodded slowly and said there was a place up the valley, about 4 miles north along the creek road, that had been sitting empty since the war, and the county had been trying to sell it for years, and the last price he had heard was $2, which was not a price for a house but a price for the county to be rid of the paperwork. The place was called the Hargrove property, and it had been, before the war, a small plantation of about 40 acres that grew tobacco and corn and kept a modest orchard of apple and pear trees along the south-facing slope above the creek. The main house was not grand. It was no columned mansion of the kind that filled the imaginations of people who had never been to Virginia. But it was substantial, a 2-story structure built of local limestone and heavy oak timbers, with a central hall plan and 4 rooms on each floor and a detached kitchen connected to the main house by a covered breezeway. The roof was cedar shake, and fully a third of it had collapsed on the east side, letting 11 years of rain and snow and leaf fall into the upper rooms, which had rotted the floorboards and brought down a section of the ceiling into what had once been a parlor. The windows were gone, not broken but removed, taken by scavengers who could sell the glass, and the openings gaped like empty eye sockets in the pale limestone walls. The front door hung from one hinge, and the porch had buckled where a locust tree had grown up through the boards, splitting them apart with the patient, irresistible force of a living thing that did not know it was destroying something. The stone foundation was sound. Eliza walked the entire perimeter, pressing her hand against the walls, feeling for cracks, for settling, for the telltale bulge that meant a wall was leaning and would eventually fall. The limestone was solid, 2 feet thick at the base, laid in courses with lime mortar that had hardened over the decades into something nearly as strong as the stone itself. The chimney on the west end stood straight and true, a massive column of the same limestone, with a firebox wide enough to hold a 4-foot log and a hearthstone that was a single slab of blue-gray slate, cracked across one corner but otherwise intact. The east chimney had partially collapsed, and its stones lay in a heap inside what had been a bedroom. But the west chimney, the main chimney, the one that served the great room and the kitchen beyond, was as solid as the day it was built. Inside, the damage was worse than it appeared from outside, but it was damage of neglect, not of violence. The plaster walls had fallen away in sheets, exposing the lath beneath, which was hand-split oak and still sound where it had stayed dry. The staircase to the second floor was missing 4 treads, but the stringers were intact. Heavy oak planks notched into the wall, framing with mortise and tenon joints that had not moved in decades. The floors on the west side of the house, the dry side, sheltered by the intact portion of the roof, were dirty and stained but solid. Wide planks of heart pine that had darkened to the color of molasses and still held their nails. The kitchen building was in better shape than the main house, being smaller and more tightly built, with a stone floor and a cooking fireplace with an iron crane still hanging in place, though the crane's hook was missing. The breezeway roof had fallen, but the posts still stood, and the framing could be rebuilt with straight poles and new shakes. The orchard was a wilderness of unpruned branches and suckers and wild grape, but Eliza could see beneath the tangle the shapes of trees that had been well planted and well spaced, and that still bore fruit. She found 3 apples on the ground beneath one tree, small and scarred, but sweet when she bit into them. The tobacco fields were gone to goldenrod and broom sedge, but the corn bottom along the creek still showed dark, rich soil where the water had deposited silt every spring for centuries. She walked the property for 2 hours, touching things, measuring with her eyes, cataloging what was ruined and what was waiting. She saw what other people would not have seen, that the bones of this place were good, that the stone was true, that the timber was old growth and would outlast anything cut in her lifetime, that the land wanted to grow things, and the water ran clean and cold and close. She went back to Amos Kettle's store that afternoon and told him she wanted to buy it. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but something in between, and he got out the county ledger and wrote up the transfer on a half-sheet of foolscap, and Eliza Kane pressed her 2 silver dollars onto the counter. The $2 Horace Pemberton had enclosed in her eviction note, the sum total of her worth in his estimation, and she signed her name, and the Hargrove property was hers. She owned 40 acres of overgrown valley land, a limestone house with a broken roof, a detached kitchen, a ruined orchard, and a fireplace with a hearthstone she had not yet thought to look beneath. She had no money left. She had a rucksack, a blanket, a farrier's rasp, a beekeeper's notebook, and a house that most people in the valley considered not a house at all, but a monument to what the war had taken and what time had not bothered to give back. She carried her rucksack up the creek road in the late afternoon light, and the shadows of the mountains stretched across the valley floor like long blue fingers, and the air was cold enough that she could see her breath, and she walked through the broken front door of the Hargrove house and set her rucksack down on the heart pine floor of the great room and stood there in the silence, listening to the wind move through the empty window frames and the creak of the one remaining shutter and the distant sound of the creek running over stones. And she thought, "This is mine, not given, not inherited, not permitted, bought with the only money she had in the world, money that had been meant as a dismissal, as a final transaction between herself and the people who should have loved her, and she had turned it into something else entirely. Not a closing, but an opening. Not an ending, but the first page of a life she would write herself, in her own hand, on the walls of a house that had been forgotten by everyone except the land it stood on. She lived in the great room for the first week, sleeping on the heart pine floor with her blanket folded double beneath her and her rucksack as a pillow. And she spent the daylight hours clearing debris from the rooms she could save and stacking what she could not save in the yard for burning. She ate cornmeal mush cooked in a tin pot she found in the kitchen building, and she drank water from the creek carried in a clay jug that had been sitting on a shelf in the kitchen for 11 years, with a skin of dust so thick it looked like gray velvet. On the 9th day, she turned her attention to the west fireplace. It drew well. She had been burning small fires in it every evening to take the chill off the great room, but the hearthstone troubled her. The crack she had noticed on her first visit ran diagonally across the slab from the right front corner to a point about 2/3 of the way back, and the smaller piece created by this crack had settled slightly, perhaps half an inch lower than the larger piece, which meant either the support beneath it had given way, or there was a void underneath. She knelt on the stone and pressed her palms flat against it, and felt the smaller section shift under her weight, just barely. A movement so slight it was more sensation than observation. She got her father's rasp from her rucksack and used the flat end to scrape the mortar from the joint between the two pieces of slate, working carefully, the way Thomas Kane had taught her to work. Not forcing the tool, but letting it find the line of least resistance. The mortar was old andite and came away in dry powder. When the joint was clean, she worked the rasp's edge under the smaller piece and levered it upward, and it came free more easily than she expected, because it had been lifted before. Beneath the slab was not packed earth or rubble fill, which is what she would have expected beneath a hearthstone laid on a proper foundation. Instead, there was a cavity, a rectangular space about 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 8 inches deep, lined on all four sides with flat stones set on edge and covered on the bottom with a piece of oilcloth that had been folded carefully and pressed into the space with the deliberateness of someone who intended what they placed here to last. Eliza sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. The oilcloth was dark with age but intact, and when she lifted it out, she could feel the weight of something inside. Not heavy, but substantial, the weight of a book or a small box. She carried it to the window where the light was strongest and unfolded it on the floor. Inside the oilcloth were three things. The first was a leather pouch, soft and darkened with handling, drawn shut with a cord. The second was a small wooden box, about the size of a man's hand, made of walnut and joined at the corners with dovetails so precise they looked machine-cut, but were not. The third was a letter, folded into thirds and sealed with a drop of candle wax that had yellowed, but not cracked. She opened the leather pouch first. Inside were coins. Not silver dollars, but gold pieces, double eagles, $20 gold coins with Liberty on one side and an eagle on the other. She counted them twice. There were 14. $280 in gold, which was more money than her father had earned in 2 years of shoeing horses. More money than Horace Pemberton kept in his store safe on any given Saturday. More money than Eliza had ever held in her hands or expected to hold. She set the coins on the oilcloth in 2 neat rows and opened the wooden box. Inside, resting on a piece of cotton batting that had yellowed to the color of old cream, was a woman's brooch, a small oval of carved ivory set in a silver frame, and the carving was a profile of a young woman with her hair swept up and a high collar at her throat, and the work was so fine that Eliza could see the individual strands of hair and the slight curve of the woman's smile. It was the kind of object that is not valuable by the standards of auction houses, but is priceless by the standards of the human heart. A thing made with love, carried with love, hidden with love. She held it in her palm and felt the warmth of it, the smoothness of the ivory, and she set it down gently beside the coins and picked up the letter. She broke the wax seal and unfolded the paper, which was heavy stock, the kind used for legal documents, and the handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. And she read it in the quiet of the great room with the afternoon light falling through the empty window frame and the sound of the creek in the distance. The letter read, "My name is Adelaide Hargrove, and I am writing this on the 14th of March, 1862, in the house my husband James and I built together in the year 1839. I am 61 years old. James has been dead for 3 years, and our son William was killed at Manassas last July. And I am alone now in this house which was built for a family and which has become very quiet. I do not know how much longer I will stay. The war is coming closer, and there are soldiers on the road every week, and I have heard that they are taking what they find in the houses they pass through. And so I am putting away what I have left of value in a place where it will not be found by men who are looking for things to take. The coins in this pouch are the savings of 23 years. James and I put aside what we could, a little each season after the tobacco was sold and the debts were paid. And it was never much in any single year, but it accumulated the way water accumulates in a cistern, slowly and without drama, and it became something substantial. I had intended it for William. I had intended many things for William. The brooch was carved by James in the winter of 1840, the first winter after we were married, when the snow was deep and there was nothing to do but sit by this fire and work with his hands. He carved it from a piece of ivory he had traded for in Staunton, and he said it was my likeness, though I told him he had made me prettier than I was, and he said he had made me exactly as I was, and that I was the one who could not see it. I have worn it every day since, and I am taking it off now for the first time in 22 years, and putting it in this box, and putting the box in this hole in the ground. And I will tell you that my hand does not want to let it go. But I would rather it be hidden and safe than taken by a stranger who does not know what it means. To whoever finds this, I do not know who you are or when you will come, or what will have brought you to this house. But if you are here, then you have need of shelter, and if you have lifted this stone, then perhaps you have need of what is beneath it. Take it. Take all of it. Use the money to mend what is broken, and plant what has gone fallow, and make this house a living place again. That is all I ask, that someone live here, that someone light a fire in this fireplace, and cook a meal in that kitchen, and walk through that orchard in the spring when the pear trees bloom. James and I were happy here. It was a good house and good land, and it deserved better than to be left empty. I hope you will be happy here too. I hope you will find what you need. Adelaide Hargrove, written in her own hand, in the house her husband built, on a cold night in March, with the fire burning low. Eliza read the letter twice, and then a third time. And on the third reading, her vision blurred, and she set the letter down on her knee and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and sat very still for a long time. She did not cry the way people cry in stories, dramatically, with sobs and shaking shoulders. She cried the way people cry when something they did not know they were carrying is finally set down. Quietly, with relief, with a gratitude so large it has no words, only weight. She did not spend the gold all at once. She was not a woman who had ever had money, and she understood instinctively that the value of money lay not in what it could buy in a single day, but in what it could sustain over months and years. She went to Amos Kettle's store the next morning and bought 20 pounds of cornmeal, 10 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of salt, a pound of coffee, a box of nails, a coil of rope, a pane of window glass, and a bar of lye soap, and she paid for it with 1 gold coin and received her change in silver and paper, and felt the strange vertigo of being a person who could buy things without calculating whether the purchase would mean going hungry. She told Amos about the house, not about the gold, not about the letter, just about the work that needed doing. And he listened with his hands folded on the counter, and then said there was a man named Cyrus Bell who lived about 2 miles south of Millbrook, who had been a carpenter before the war, and who still did work when his back allowed it, and that she might talk to him about the roof. Cyrus Bell was 64 years old, with a white beard that he kept trimmed close to his jaw and hands that were enormous and gentle and scarred across every knuckle. He came to the Hargrove property on a Wednesday morning, walked through the house without speaking, climbed a ladder to the roof line, came back down, and said, "Cedar shake. I can get you cedar from the Dawson mill. Take about 400 board feet for the east side. I'll need a helper." She told him she would be the helper. He looked at her the way Amos Kettle had looked at her, that expression between pity and admiration. And then he nodded and said, "We start Monday." They started Monday. Cyrus showed her how to strip the old shakes, working from the ridge down, prying each one loose with a flat bar and letting it slide down the roof slope into a pile on the ground. He showed her how to lay new shakes in staggered courses with a 2-inch overlap, nailing each one with 2 galvanized nails set an inch from the edge, and how to cut the shakes at the ridge line so they interlocked like fingers and shed water in both directions. They worked for 11 days on the roof, and during those 11 days, Eliza learned things about Cyrus Bell, that he had lost his wife to typhoid in 1858 and his only daughter to diphtheria in 1863, and that he had built 17 houses in the valley before the war and had not built a single one after it, and that he kept a daguerreotype of his daughter in a tin case in his shirt pocket and touched it sometimes without seeming to know he was doing it. On the 4th day, a woman named Ruth Jessup appeared at the property with a pot of bean soup and a loaf of cornbread wrapped in a cloth. Ruth was 52, the wife of a hay farmer named Edgar Jessup, and she had a face that looked like it had been designed specifically for the purpose of feeding people, broad and warm and incapable of concealing either concern or satisfaction. She set the pot on the kitchen hearth and said, "Cyrus told me there was a girl up here fixing the Hargrove place. I thought you might be hungry." She did not wait for thanks. She came back 2 days later with a crock of butter and a jar of pickled beets, and the day after that she brought her husband Edgar, who was 60 and built like a fence post, tall, thin, weathered, and absolutely vertical. And Edgar looked at the porch where the locust tree had grown through the boards and said, "I can pull that out with my team if you want. Take about an hour." He pulled it out in 40 minutes. The hole it left was 2 feet across, and Eliza filled it with new boards that Cyrus helped her cut and fit. And when it was done, the porch looked like a garment that had been patched by someone who cared more about function than appearance. Which is to say, it looked like it was loved. A man named Solomon Pratt, who was 38 and operated the grist mill on the creek a mile south of the property, brought her a sack of ground corn and a sack of wheat flour and refused payment and said only, "Adelaide Hargrove gave my mother flour when we had nothing. Consider it returned." A woman named Della Sims, who was 45 and kept goats on a hillside farm above Millbrook, brought her a nanny goat that was fresh in milk and said she had more goats than she needed, and that the animal's name was Patience, which Eliza thought was either a name or an instruction. Each person who came brought something specific and left without ceremony, and Eliza began to understand that this was how community worked in the valley. Not through declarations or meetings or organized charity, but through the steady accumulation of small practical acts, each one a sentence in a conversation that had been going on for generations. The weeks became months. Eliza repaired the staircase, cutting new treads from oak planks that Cyrus helped her mill from a tree that had fallen across the creek road in a November storm. She reglazed 4 windows with glass she bought from a supplier in Staunton, setting each pane in putty she made from linseed oil and chalk dust, the way Mabel Thorne had taught her. She rebuilt the breezeway between the main house and the kitchen, setting new locust posts in holes she dug herself and framing the roof with poplar poles and covering it with shakes left over from the main roof repair. She cleaned the cooking fireplace and found the missing crane hook in a pile of debris in the corner of the kitchen, rusted but sound. And she heated it in a fire she built in the yard and hammered it straight on a flat stone and rehung it on the crane and boiled water on it that evening and drank tea made from dried mint she had found growing wild along the creek bank. She pruned the orchard over the course of 3 weeks in December, working methodically from tree to tree, cutting away dead wood and suckers and crossing branches with a saw she borrowed from Cyrus and her father's rasp, which she used to smooth the cuts so they would heal cleanly. She found 23 apple trees, 11 pear trees, and 4 cherry trees, and of these, 31 were alive and capable of bearing fruit, and she stood among them on a cold December afternoon with wood chips in her hair and sap on her hands, and felt the particular satisfaction of having revealed something beautiful that had been hidden beneath neglect. She cleared a 1/4 acre of the creek bottom and turned the soil with a mattock she bought in Staunton, and planted winter rye as a cover crop. And in the spring, she would plant corn and beans and squash in the dark river-bottom soil that Adelaide Hargrove's letter had asked her to bring back to life. She set up 2 beehives in the orchard using boxes she built from scrap lumber and baited with honeycomb she found in a hollow sycamore along the creek. And she tended them wearing Mabel Thorne's veil, which still smelled faintly of smoke and lavender and the particular dusty sweetness of an old woman's house. By January, the house was weather-tight. By February, it was warm. By March, the pear trees were blooming, just as Adelaide had said they would, and the blossoms were white and fragile and so thick on the branches that from a distance the orchard looked like it was covered in snow, and Eliza stood on the porch she had repaired and looked at them and thought of a woman she had never met who had loved this place enough to write a letter to a stranger and ask them to make it live again. Spring came to the valley the way spring comes to mountain places. Not all at once, but in stages, like a person waking slowly from a long sleep. First, the creek rose with snowmelt and ran fast and brown and loud over the stones. Then the willows along the bank turned yellow-green at their tips. Then the redbuds bloomed on the hillsides, and the dogwoods, and the wild azaleas in the understory of the woods above the orchard, and the air filled with the sound of returning birds, and the smell of warming earth, and the particular electric sweetness of a world that has been dormant and is no longer. Eliza planted her garden in April, corn and pole beans and summer squash and tomatoes and peppers and herbs, and she planted it in rows as straight as sentences, and she watered it from the creek with buckets she carried on a yoke she carved from a piece of ash, and she watched it grow with the attention of someone who understands that a garden is not a thing you make, but a conversation you have with the soil and the rain and the sun, and that your part in the conversation is mostly listening. The goat Patience gave milk every morning and evening, and Eliza learned to make cheese from Ruth Jessup, who came to the property every Thursday now with something: a jar of preserves, a bundle of onion sets, a length of cloth, a piece of advice delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone, regardless of whether it concerned the proper time to plant potatoes or the proper way to grieve a father. People in Millbrook knew her name now. Amos Kettle called her Miss Kane and kept a running account for her at the store that she paid monthly. Solomon Pratt ground her corn without charge and said it was still part of the flour debt his family owed the Hargroves. Della Sims brought a second goat, a kid this time, and said Patience needed company. Cyrus Bell came by every week or so, not to work, but to sit on the porch and drink coffee and look at the orchard and say very little, which was his way of saying he was glad the house was alive again. Eliza began shoeing horses for the valley's farmers, working out of a small forge she built against the south wall of the kitchen building, using stones from the collapsed east chimney and a bellows she made from 2 boards and a piece of leather. And the farmers came to her because she was good, and because she was fair, and because she handled their animals with a gentleness that made the horses stand quiet under her hands. She charged $2 a horse, which was the going rate, and she saved what she did not need, the way Adelaide and James Hargrove had saved. Slowly, without drama, the way water accumulates in a cistern. She was not wealthy. She was not comfortable in the way that word is usually meant, but she was fed and warm and occupied and known, and she was building something that was hers, and the building of it was itself a kind of happiness that she had not known existed. The happiness of competence applied to purpose, of labor that leaves marks you can see and touch and stand inside of. On an evening in late May, when the light lasted until nearly 8 o'clock, and the air was warm and heavy with the smell of cut grass and honeysuckle, Eliza sat in the great room of the Hargrove house, her house now, in a chair that Cyrus Bell had made for her as a gift. A simple ladder-back chair with a woven hickory bark seat that was more comfortable than any chair she had ever sat in. The fire was low in the west fireplace, just enough to take the edge off the evening chill, and the hearthstone was back in place. Both pieces level now because she had packed the void beneath with rubble and mortar and made it solid. Adelaide Hargrove's letter was in the walnut box on the mantel, beside the ivory brooch, and beside Mabel Thorne's notebook, and beside her father's rasp. And these 4 objects sat together in a row like members of a family that had never met in life, but had found each other here, in this room, through the improbable arithmetic of loss and persistence and time. She thought about Adelaide, who had carved out a life in this valley with a husband who made beautiful things with his hands, and a son she would outlive, and a war that would take everything except the house and the land, and the hope she had buried beneath the hearthstone. She thought about Mabel Thorne, who had taught her that competence was the one thing no one could take away, and who had been right about that, as she had been right about nearly everything. She thought about her father, Thomas Kane, who had given her a rasp and told her it was the most honest tool he owned because it could only remove what was not needed, and she understood now that he had been talking about more than hooves. She thought about her mother, Catherine, who had been afraid and tired, and who had let Horace Pemberton make a decision that was not his to make. And she found that she could think about her mother without anger now, which was not the same as forgiveness, but was perhaps the road that led there. She did not think about Horace Pemberton at all. He was not worth the space he would have occupied in her mind, and she had learned, in these months of work and solitude and slow accumulation, that the mind, like a house, has a finite number of rooms, and you must choose carefully what you put in them. She looked at the fire, and she looked at the objects on the mantel, and she looked at the walls of the room, which she had replastered herself with a mixture of lime and sand and horsehair, and which were not smooth or perfect, but were solid and white and clean and hers. She listened to the sound of the creek through the open window, and the sound of Patience bleating softly in the barn she had built behind the kitchen, and the sound of the last birds settling into the orchard for the night. And she felt something she had not felt since she was a child, standing beside her father at his anvil. The feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do in a place that knew her name. Eliza Kane was 20 years old when she was thrown out of her family's house with $2 silver and a note pinned to her rucksack. She had no home, no family, no money beyond those 2 coins, and no plan except to walk until she found a place that would have her. She spent those $2 on a forgotten plantation in a valley she had never seen. A house with a broken roof and empty windows, and a fireplace with a cracked hearthstone that hid the savings and the hopes of a woman who had been dead for nearly a decade. It was the best $2 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And ask yourself this: what forgotten place in your own life might be waiting for someone to lift the stone and find what was buried there all along?